Hello, my name is SilvanJongerius and I'm the managing partner of Tech GDPR. Tech GDPR is a boutique consultancy for data protection for technology companies, particularly in blockchain, AI, and IoT. Today, I'd like to talk about how blockchain specifically challenges the GDPR. I was supposed to do this and this the DSSITSEC conference in Riga while I was at another conference in Amsterdam. But then as calendar appointments started to conflict and become a lot more difficult, unfortunately it didn't work out in the end for me to be there live. Yet I'm very happy that I do have the opportunity to talk to you remotely um, in this recorded video that you then have the opportunity to watch afterwards. Also, if you have any questions, do reach out to me on, for example, Twitter, email, or any other way that you see fit. I'm happy to answer any questions, as this is a topic that I love speaking about. Um, so there's two things in my that really drive me in my professional life, and one is decentralization, and the other one is privacy, hidden under my camera screen over here. Normally, that then resolves in blockchain as a practical application of decentralization, and the GDPR from the privacy aspect of the concrete implementation. The, um, the first things, decentralization and privacy, actually go together pretty well, but blockchain and GDPR not so much. There are some of the specifics in both blockchain and the GDPR that are very difficult to combine in such a way that it makes sense. So the key properties of blockchain, immutability, the distributed nature of blockchain, the fact that it's timestamped, every block has their own timestamp, the transparency of information in blockchain, permissionlessness of blockchain, and the key fact that it's a very great, very interesting way to do value transfer, make it a very special technology. There are different blockchain types. There's public permissionless, there's public permissioned, there's private permissionless and private permissioned. And if we're talking about GDPR specifically, but also how other regulations and structures impact on the GDPR, we need to be very careful that we don't say blockchain in general, because the implementation of these things is always different depending on which specific type of blockchain you're looking at. Um, the first technical concept that I want to have a look at is our hashes, and I believe that people in watching this video should have a rough understanding of what hashes are. If not, do have a look at Wikipedia. It's a very interesting concept, but in a nutshell, what it does, it augments text or data of an arbitrary size into text of a fixed size. And it does that with a very high consistency, meaning that the same input text or the same input data will always result in the same output data as well. In this example, the data-strict relationship between blockchain and GDPR, if we hash that with the same algorithm, always the same hash value will result of it. The same thing you can do with, for example, a photo. If we make a hash out of that, it will be the same. And now you may start to see, like, okay, if we want to compare a photo that once was taken to a new version, and basically make sure, for example, for electronic evidence, making sure that it hasn't been changed. The only thing that you would have to do is run it through a hashing algorithm and see if the hashes compare. You don't have to compare it pixel by pixel. So that makes it very interesting to like an interesting use case. Another interesting use case is, for example, with web content. If we look at the Wikipedia article about blockchain, if we want to see if it has changed, we just need to run it through a hashing algorithm and see if the same hash comes out at a later point in time. Very interesting for electronic evidence or making sure that data doesn't change, etc. The same principle is also been used in blockchain. So if we look at what blockchain is and does, it is actually different transactions packed in different blocks that are then linked together. And how it's linked together, if we look here, it's linked together with a hash. So the hash of all the data in a block is always calculated, and the hash of the previous block is included as piece of data in the next block, which then again is hashed. Now, these hashes need to be correct for the blockchain to stay intact. If this breaks, then the link between these blocks is broken and this won't work anymore. So this is one of the security mechanisms, or actually the security mechanism of blockchain, that makes sure that these blocks are linked. And if anything in the past would have changed, for example, if the hash in block 20 would have changed, the data in block 21 should have changed, and therefore the hash should change. And basically the whole chain falls down like a game of domino. So let's have another look at specifically at what the GDPR requires. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, requires that data is being processed in a lawful, fair, and transparent way. There is a purpose limitation. You can only collect data for a certain purpose and use it then for that same purpose. So for example, if you collect personal data for one reason, you cannot suddenly switch into using it for another reason. There's the concept of data minimization. You can only collect the minimum amount of data that is required for the specific purpose that you have claimed to have. The data needs to be accurate. There needs to be storage limitation. You cannot keep it for forever. You always need to say, okay, for this purpose, we believe we need it for 3 months, 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 weeks. You need to make sure that the data is kept for only that period of time. The data needs to be stored and handled with integrity and confidentiality. And the key principle that I like always to refer to if you explain the GDPR in 1 or 2 sentences is it's all about accountability. If you're responsible for handling certain person's personal data under the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, you need to make sure that you take accountability for it, that you do what is in your power to protect that data and to handle it as fair and transparent as possible. The roles under the GDPR are very strictly and clearly defined, right? The data subject is the natural person whose data is being processed. The controller determines the purpose and the means of the processing of personal data. And then there's the processor that processes personal data on specific written instructions of the controller. This is very clear, and this is a concept that works very well if you think about there's a company that has a server, perhaps uses a third-party service even to do certain things, could be data entry or website hosting for them. But there always needs to be this like clear-cut relationships. That's one of the key requirements of the GDPR. The GDPR requires that every data processing activity has an appropriate legal base. One of them can be consent. There could be the performance of a contract. It could be a legal obligation. Then there are two things that not very often apply in private situations: that protect the vital interest or a task in the public interest or authority. And there is legitimate interest. Now, you probably have heard about consent. What consent does, basically, based on some prior information, the question is being asked like, hey, are you okay with us processing the data? That only holds up on the specific conditions if the information has been made clear, if the question has been asked, if people are being given real choice, so not a pre-tick checkbox, for example. But this has been overused in general. The better legal basis to look at is, for example, the performance of a contract. If you have an ongoing contract with someone, there's no need to also ask for their consent to process the data for the needs of that specific contract. If you're doing invoicing in Germany, where I'm based, you need to keep trade invoices for 10 years. That's a legal obligation. So data on an invoice you can also keep for 10 years. That's there. You don't need consent for that again. And then there's legitimate interest. Legitimate interest does as much as requiring that you do a balance check between what is your interest in keeping the data or processing the data of a subject and what is the interest of the data subject to keep the data private and for the data not to be processed. Now, if you do an assessment and if you figure out that your legitimate interest overweights the interest of the natural person to their privacy, you can most certainly, based on this assessment, process their personal data. It has an asterisk to it. You need to do a bit of work to basically make sure that you can do it. You need to be able to defend this assessment, and anyone is able to just say, hey, well, wait, about the legitimate interest. I feel that because of my individual circumstances, this doesn't apply in this case. So there are always exceptions to this, and doesn't make it easier, but it's certainly something that in certain cases can very well be used. And one great example is, for example, server log files. If you're keeping server logs, which almost everyone is doing, you do that to keep your server secure, to monitor performance, and a few more things. Now, that is a great legitimate interest, and there's no need to ask for consent of a website visitor if you can log their access record in your server log. That's actually very unpractical. So a great case for legitimate interest. Under legitimate interest, you can probably keep it for 2, 3, 4 weeks, perhaps in certain branches up to 6 months. But you always need to outweigh or weight like what is a reasonable amount of time to keep these log files under legitimate interest. Right. So what about the compatibility between blockchain and the GDPR? And that's actually where it gets more tricky. There's quite a bit of misalignment, like visionary misalignment between the GDPR and blockchain. So if you look at the GDPR, that knows a storage limitation in Article 5.1e, and blockchain is immutable, cannot be changed anymore, because of if you would change anything, the hashes would change. There is also the point of confidentiality, where that's a great aspect. Public blockchain or public permissionless blockchain has the concept that everything on chain is public. Not great for alignment and confidentiality with the GDPR. There's the concept of accountability in the GDPR, and in blockchain, it's rather the opposite. That's the big question. Who is responsible for the data that's being processed? Especially if you look at all these different nodes, and let's have a look at that actually. So who is controller and who is processor? Now, in a centralized classical situation, think about your bank or a service provider, a website. There's the central entity in the middle that has defined how is data being processed, what is happening with the data, how long is it being kept for, and makes it clear to all the data subjects around it. So these relationships are very clear. The controller is in the middle and the data subjects are around. Now, if this controller uses another party to do certain things for them, there's another auxiliary relationship that you need to argue for, and there needs to be a contract between this central controlling entity and the other entity that may be doing processing, but you can argue for that, but still a highly centralized system. Now, centralization is something that is not very feasible in a decentralized environment that looks a little bit more like this. Every node is a participant in the network. They act like equal parties to each other. There's not so much of a central authority. There's even not one of the nodes that can say, okay, we'll switch everything off. It's all decentralized. So information normally arrives at one node and is then through that one node disseminated to the rest of the network. The big question here is, who is actually the controller and who's the processor? And in the same notion, like who is responsible in the end for what is happening in a decentralized blockchain, distributed ledger technology field. Now, the right to be forgotten is something where many people stumble upon, and so the GDPR knows Article 17, the right to erasure data subject, if there's no remaining legal base for their data to be processed, can request the erasure of their data. The other thing is with blockchain and immutability. As I demonstrated before, blockchain is highly immutable, or most of the concepts in it are immutable, and therefore these things in general clash. Getting back into hashing a little bit. So another way of looking at hashing is, for example, if I take my personal data, my first name, last name, my photo, and make these kind of things into a hash, then that hash will always be the same as long as the algorithm stays the same and as long as my data stays the same. Or if it's the same ID document, it should always result in the same data. Now, how is this a problem under the GDPR? Well, if I would put this on a blockchain, I would say, well, there's no way of just using this hash and deriving the data or my personal data directly from it. And that is true. It's only one way, so you can only go from the personal data to the hash and not the other way around. But the thing that you can do is recalculate this hash, and that's exactly the use of it, right? So if I would take my passport again with the same hashing algorithm, that would always result in the same hash. That means that anyone that has my passport and has the hashing algorithm can recreate that hash and also see by that virtue where and how I interacted on the blockchain. Or we can have a look at patterns that may appear on the blockchain. Perhaps I purchase something on a regular base using cryptocurrency that is backed by blockchain. These are all possibilities that you need to think about. How do these points of behavioral data also constitute data, and how does it make it on the blockchain? Now, having said that, we need to be very careful with putting hashes of personal data on the blockchain. In general, that's still in scope of the GDPR. It's just seen as pseudonymous data. That basically means that using additional information, you'd be able to relay that to a natural person. Therefore, in scope of the GDPR, and should in general underlay the right to be forgotten. So even these hashes that are very common on blockchain should normally be deletable if they are derived from personal data. Other problems that we see is that we have lack of experience with the GDPR. It's a very new regulation. We had it not even, well, I would say almost a year and a half right now. There are some court decisions, nothing too interesting in the field of emerging technology or the Web3 stack or blockchain, DLT, even AI, not so much. There's a lack of guidance. There's outdated guidance on anonymization and pseudonymization, which is a very crucial difference under the GDPR. And this particular difference is also very, very important in blockchain. Like the moment that we know what is personal data and what is not personal data anymore, we can start making technical decisions. But at this moment, we cannot really do that because we miss the precise guidance. The guidance that we have, the 30-something page document from 2014, is not officially adopted by the European Data Protection Board, and therefore we cannot count on it. Blockchain is an emerging technology. There's and that meeting a new regulation such as the GDPR is certainly challenging. There are local implementations of the GDPR and they're very high fines for non-compliance to the GDPR. And you may have heard about the 20 million or 4% of total annual group turnover. So these numbers are certainly giving us something to think about. And therefore, this uncertainty and the huge fines, of course, do prove to be a bit of a hurdle for innovation because there's hardly any certainty, and if you do it wrong, you don't know what is wrong yet, you'll get fined for a huge amount. So is there anything positive about it? And I certainly think there is. Now, there's certainly also visionary alignment. If we look at some other key principles of the GDPR, transparency, for example, is a requirement. What we spoke about in the basic principles. And in blockchain, public permissionless blockchain, all data is shared with all participants. In the GDPR, the requirement of data minimization is also attainable with blockchain if we only store confirmation hashes if we add enough information to it, we can move it out of scope of the we can ensure it's anonymous enough to be stored on chain, or we can go into the direction of proving facts through zero knowledge proofs. Very interesting concept. You should definitely look up. GDPR also mandates the control over one's own data. And this is also something where we can really attain these kind of principles by looking at self-sovereign identity, where the identity is actually living on your device, and only the facts or the proofs of certain things you would share with the participants or the companies that you interact with, basically making sure that they don't all build up their own data silos, collect massive amounts of data, and you retain control over your own data. A very interesting concept you should certainly look into. Storing personal data off-chain, for example, having a decentralized or centralized database where the personal details live, the first name, last name, zip code, email, and only the confirmation hash is stored on-chain. Again, this is not a panacea. This could still be seen as personal data, but it's certainly pseudonymized personal data. And if this algorithm is composed in the right way, it could, according to certain experts, also be seen as anonymous personal data. What you do in all cases is implement a great technical measure to protect that data by only having the confirmation, only the elements that you really need on chain. And the other thing is you also, in all likeliness, you save quite a bit of money. Normally using blockchain for large data sets is not a great idea, it's expensive, and doesn't make it very fast. So how about this right to be forgotten? I think in most circles it is perceived like this, quite a bit of a disaster. In my opinion, it's more like this. It's quite inconvenient. You don't really want to deal with it, but well, you can find ways around it. Now, how do you find ways around it? Looking at the circles that I drawn earlier, and if you look at the GDPR's Article 17, the right to erasure, it is a lot more relative than what you expect. It is not so absolute. It only applies if certain other, basically if the data processing is based on certain legal basis. But for example, if I need to keep my trade invoice for 10 years, during that 10-year period of time, I can still retain that data. There's no need for me to delete that data because there's an overruling argument. There are also legal bases that could be seen as persistent. And if there's a persistent legal base, then you may as well be able to store that data in a blockchain. And the same actually is for blockchain's immutability, which is also not absolute. Now, if you look at the basic principle, many people say, well, yes, it is. But if you go back all the way in time to the first Bitcoin.pdf white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, even there was a concept described as pruning. And pruning or getting rid of certain data over time is something that is not widely implemented, but it's certainly possible. You can certainly prune data in blockchain. It is just not widely adopted or implemented. Now, this is probably technically where we need to have a look at. While legally, we need to have a look at how do we ensure that in certain cases, there is no such thing as the right to erasure, right? And the solution, if you start looking at these both things, the solution can probably be found in the middle. The other opportunity that we have is looking at contracted nodes, making sure that certain that the different players stay within Europe, so you don't need to deal with the problem of exporting data outside of Europe. And the other thing is you can indicate and contractually agree who is actually the controller in such a network and who is a processor instead. Now, this is of course something that needs to be substantiated appropriately, but there are possibilities of doing that. And if a central entity is indeed in control and that's feasible, then you look at certain like hybrid blockchain models, not completely decentralized. So perhaps we need to give in a little bit on the central element the moment we want to deal with personal data in order to make sure that there's certain central control. But that's also not impossible. From a visionary point of view, I would always advise to look at privacy by design. Think about privacy right at the beginning of your project, whenever you start with it, and make sure that you implement the privacy elements as soon as you can. And make sure that you have a privacy specialist on the table um, when you design a new product that deals with personal data, especially when using technologies such as blockchain or distributed ledger technology. Privacy by design is nothing new. That's a principle that was already coined in the 90s by Anne Cavoukian, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada. And she's still to this date fighting for privacy by design. And I think this could very well be applied onto blockchain. So one of the projects that I'm also involved in is with the DIN, the German Normalization or Standardization Institute. In that working group, we are in the final phases right now of defining a standard for privacy by design in blockchain specifically. So what is next? For example, we need to keep looking for new technical solutions. How can we implement pruning, for example, without harming the data and harming the systems around that? And there are tons of other things that we need to keep researching and keep finding more novel methods of dealing with, for example, controllership, processorship. Perhaps we should be looking at other governance structures that may make this easier. Zero knowledge proofs, certainly a very interesting concept that we need to keep looking at. Basically revolves around proving to know a value without conveying any information apart from the fact that you know the value, right? So you can, for example, I can prove that I'm over 21 to get into a club or to order a drink in certain countries. And for that, I would not need to reveal my date of birth. I would not need to reveal my age. I should just be able to mathematically soundly prove that I'm over 21. Now, let's start thinking about that as well, right? And let's start thinking about how do we avoid the spillage of information into directions where we don't need it, right? This is the only fact that should matter for someone that needs to verify that I'm of legal drinking age, for example. The other thing that I would really hope for is more guidance. There is some guidance out there. For example, this what says adopted April 2014, but it was previously adopted, but not right now. But anonymization techniques are fundamental to be used in a blockchain context. Also, the CNIL has issued some guidance. The CNIL is the French Authority for Data Protection. But it's the only authority today that came out with anything somewhat sensible with regard to blockchain. I don't necessarily agree with all the points made there, but it's commendable that they have looked at this and that they have indeed made sure that blockchain has been taken into account and considered and discussed. Right? So how can the regulator help? First of all, issue more guidance or clarify also how we should interpret certain things. There are many different people in this space out there that all have their different opinions of who should be a controller or a processor in a decentralized environment. But until we have some guidance or clarifications, we're not going to know for sure. And everyone working in this space will be having a high level of uncertainty. That's never good for innovation. So update the regulation at some point in time, I think is unavoidable. I don't see this happening in the next 3 to 4 years, but there is a 2-yearly review procedure for the GDPR. And I think there are certain elements that need to be taken into account, that especially these processor controller relationships, as we don't see them working with blockchain, may need to be reviewed or may need to have additional guidance or details. And then thirdly, finding non-compliant projects. So if there's a project that is claiming, oh, we built a GDPR compliant blockchain, but then in the end, it is actually something where one small problem is being solved. And then again, they don't have their privacy policies in order. and there are all kind of other things wrong. I think these projects need a fine and need to be investigated, and that will then bring us towards clarity. Then we know, okay, this is not how it should be done. Let's look in another direction. So even though this may not be nice for all the players in the field, this is still something that's ultimately very, very important. Then lastly, what am I actually doing? Put your money where your mouth is, right? So with Tech GDPR, we are consulting blockchain projects, also AI, IoT, but there's quite a large amount of blockchain projects at the moment. We do writing, we do research, and we also contribute to initiatives like INATPA, the International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications. So for the privacy working group at INATPA, I am the initiator and co-chair. I find this a very important group with 150 to 200 members, all blockchain stakeholders, and we're now seeking dialogue with the regulators and exploring a number of other concepts that may make the compliance to GDPR for the players in blockchain a lot easier. And thirdly, I'm also part of the DIN working group. DIN is the German Standardization Institute of Privacy by Blockchain Design. We're also looking at how can we use privacy by design to make blockchain compliant to the GDPR. It's all work in progress. A lot of interesting things happening there, but this is the directions that I'm looking into, and yeah, that's how I'm contributing to the space. Anyway, that was it for me. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to record this video and to remotely be talking to you about the problem space of blockchain and technology in general and the GDPR, and also give you some impulses for solutions and perhaps let you think about some of the possible directions that we should be going into. So should you have any questions, probably Twitter would be a great medium to post them, but also feel free to send me an email. Other than that, thank you so much for your time and for listening to me, and do reach out. Let me know something. Thank you so much.